Preservation, Canning for Beginners. That's the name of the talk I recently gave in partnership with one of our local community building groups here in Central Arkansas called Community Thrive 365. Tim and I have felt really blessed to be a part of this amazing group. And I even think Tim is planning to put together an episode about the organization itself and how it's given us an opportunity to connect our Homestead business with some of the church and community ministry work happening in our area. But one of the things the organization has given us a chance to help with is a series of community classes designed to equip folks with a variety of extremely practical skills, all the way from cooking and gardening to, most recently, the canning for beginners. The idea behind it being just to teach people how to be a little more health conscious in what they're eating and maybe a little more money conscious in what they're spending their money on to eat. You know, we live in such a fast food, convenience food society that nowadays people don't even know they can feed their families so much healthier, so much cheaper, and really so much more independently by just doing it themselves. The truth is, you don't need to be constantly going to McDonald's and Walmart or Kroger to feed your family. By learning the old-fashioned skills of growing your own garden and preserving the things you grow with home food preservation methods like canning, or it could be dehydrating, freeze-drying, all of those different ways, a family can really change the game in stocking their pantries with good food that is healthy, affordable, and honestly, it's just better tasting than store-bought stuff. So, Canning for Beginners. That's what this class is all about. To make it easier to listen to, we're going to just break it down into 3 different episodes so you can more easily digest the information in smaller portions and give you the chance to focus on the parts you are most interested in. Because folks, it's jam-packed. So here we go. Let's get started. And I hope you enjoy it. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out on a Saturday. I know that there are probably a million other things we could be doing at this time, but I am really, really excited about being able to share with you some of the things that I have learned along the road from my mom, my grandma, people in the community. You know, there's never a time when you're not going to be learning, when you ask questions and you are willing and open to the idea of teaching yourself a new and practical skill. So like you said, I'm Amy Kinnard from the Kinnard Homestead. I am a wife and mother of 5. I have 4 boys, and the 4 of them, they like to see, you know, who can eat me out of house and home in the shortest amount of time. So I have really been working towards learning how to do more things to be able to help the family out financially when it comes to food. You know, having enough food to feed the family and making meals stretch. That has become like a big thing when you have a large family. But see, canning wasn't something I naturally drifted towards. My mom got me started in water bath canning because majority of our favorite things to eat, you know, strawberry jelly or strawberry jams, spaghetti sauce, salsa, those are like the practical everyday thing that as a kid we loved and we ate it like crazy. And those are all water bath canning methods. So when I had a family and started preparing food for them, those are easy things to make using a water bath canner. The pressure canner, that didn't come along until we moved out to our 20-acre farm, and it hit me, oh goodness, if we're going to be growing all of this food on a farm, I better have the tools needed to preserve it, because, you know, there's no way in the world you can eat everything you grow. And that's when that year I saved up some Christmas money from family, and I bought my very first pressure canner, which this baby is still ticking, and now it's almost a decade old, and it still rolls. I mean, we pull it out every month and I'm canning in it. I've yet to have to replace one single part. So it tells you that even though these aren't the most expensive pressure canners out there on the market, when you take care of it and you know how to use it, it will last you. It really, really will. So it's a good investment to have. And I brought just a sample of some of the things that my family enjoys eating, things that you can make. All the way on the end, you'll see like the tallest jar, the half-gallon jar, that's just tomato soup. That can be water bathed. The trick of it is that because if you're gonna can in a half-gallon, it won't fit in your water bath canner, so that's when the bigger pressure canner comes in handy because it's tall enough to fit those big jars. But that is a water bath canning product. We also have, peaches. There's spaghetti sauce. We do applesauce. There'll also be, all the different varieties of jams and jellies. We've now started expanding. When COVID hit, we were running low on fruit, and it was hard to get out and find enough fruit to make jam for strawberries. So I had jars of peaches that were still sitting there. I'm like, let's make some peach butter. Let's combine this and blend it all up, and we'll make something else. And so we started experimenting and making different types of jams and fruit butters using what we already had. If we had extra pears sitting there, blend those up, throw it in with some applesauce, and then, make a pear applesauce or make a pear apple butter. There's all different ways that you can take what you've already canned and repurpose it into something else to fit what your need is. But there's also, we do chili sauce, ketchup, salsa, I'll do diced tomatoes, all tomato-based products you can water back in. The sky's the limit when it comes to different tomato products. But then you have on the inside part, things that have to be pressure canned. And this is where, really, when it comes to gardening, this is where you are going to excel in. Because most vegetables that you grow in your garden, besides your tomatoes and your fruits, they're all low-acid foods. And that means it has to be pressure canned. And I'll explain more so you understand how to be able to discern. But with the pressure canner, you can do carrots, potatoes, sweet potatoes, green beans, peas, corn, all of those are pressure canned, and they're so easy. You will be surprised. How many of you in here are intimidated by the thought of pressure canning? Oh yeah. I kind of figured that's what was going to be the emphasis here, is overcoming the fear of using the pressure canner. Trust me, by the end of this class, you yourselves will admit that using a pressure canner is 100 times easier than water bath canning. I will prove it to you. Once you've overcome your fear and you understand the process, so easy. That's why I said I pull this baby out at least once a month, and I'm always canning up more stuff. We do our dry beans. I don't buy canned beans at the store. It's a waste of money. I'll buy a huge, if it's in bulk, or 99 cents when they go on sale for a big 2-pound, 1-pound bag of beans, and I can them all up myself because it takes minutes to do. So today I'm going to show you that step, as well as another one that I get asked a lot about is canning chicken. How many of you guys like chicken, canned chicken? Do you know how expensive those itty bitty little cans are at the store? And when you open them up, it's kind of like, they don't have a lot of flavor. That is not true when you home can chicken breast. It is tender, flaky, and all of that liquid inside the jar, that's not water, that's chicken broth. That comes from the chicken as it cooks down. And it is so packed with flavor, you just mix it. You actually kind of want to dilute it with some water because it's so strong and potent. Add it to your soups, add it to your casseroles. You just chop up those chunks of chicken in there, boom, there's your casserole. It is the easiest meal prep there is, and the flavor, it's out of this world. You don't even want to go back to the store-bought stuff. You don't. So that's when you're able to take advantage of sales. You can, when chicken goes on sale for 99 cents, and it's like the little scrap pieces that nobody kind of wants, grab them. Those are the perfect canning pieces to do for canning chicken. It's wonderful. So those are just some of the ways of doing that. But I don't know about you guys. One of my favorite things to do is to sit down and talk with the older generation. Like I said, canning was not my biggest thing, but I have learned so much from talking to people. Some of the conversations that stick out to me the most are ones that I've had with a few of the older ladies at our church. One in particular, Miss Sanja, who lives just down the road from here. She grew up in the Crystal Hill area her entire life. And she has stories about how, her parents going through the Great Depression era, as well as the World War II era, and then post-World War II. And I love listening to these because I'm just like, how did you do it? How? Why? What? And I love listening to her just reminisce about how their family, how they made things go. But she had quoted this one saying. She's like, I remember it was just drilled into us. It was, eat what you can and can what you can't. And I thought, what? And that it just started to kind of like stew in my mind. Eat what you can and can what you can't. You see, it was because when World War II happened, there was a shortage of food everywhere, right? And that's when our government was like, you need to plant a garden. And they were called victory gardens because they said food will win the war. If they had food to send to the troops, that means that their troops were fed, they could help our allies out there, all of it. And so they came up with the Victory Garden slogan, eat what you can and can what you can't eat. And this is so true today. You plant your garden, and if you're like us, we always double what we're going to plant because we know our dog's going to ruin it. We might have a bad cold snap, drought, bugs. you name it, something's gonna get it. So we might have 50% of the harvest. So we always plant more. Sometimes everything goes great and we end up having like a really, really big bumper harvest. And I'm like, what am I gonna do? Oh, we've got all this food. Well, you eat what you can fresh. But there comes a point in time when you're like, I am so sick of tomatoes. If I see another tomato, I'm just gonna puke. Or, squash, zucchini. You're like, how many ways can you eat a zucchini? I mean, you're tired of it. And so this whole mentality of you eat it while it's fresh, but then after that, can it. Set it aside, preserve it for those winter months when you're not gonna have fresh vegetables to go and pick off the vine. You want to have something. So I loved how they had these. We found all these little snapshots and talking about the past history, but it's, of course I can. I'm patriotic as can be, and ration points won't worry me. Now, what's funny about this is looking at the ration cards that they had back then during World War II, one of the most expensive items on there that you had to use ration points for, canned fruits and vegetables. The things that you can produce yourself in your own kitchen, from your own garden, or going to the fruit orchards around here from farmers and doing it yourself, those were the most expensive items. It doesn't make sense in my mind. Like, why would people spend all their food rations on canned food when they could have done it themselves? You could have as much fruit and vegetables as you want. There were no rations on that. It was the preserved foods. So think about the people who were growing it in their yards, growing their food, and they started canning it themselves. It lowered the amount needed at the stores, so it like kind of balances out the supply and demand. And it even came down to like the sugar rations. This is crazy. As of this year, 2022, the U.S. average sugar consumption per person is 12.67 pounds per month. 12.67. They were down to 2 pounds per month per person. 2 pounds of sugar a month. And we go through almost 13 pounds. We eat a lot of sugar now. But think about that. 2 pounds per month. So if I think about our family, okay, that meant that if we lived during that time, I would have been only allotted 14 pounds of sugar a month. I would have had to been very, very careful about what I baked, what I canned, because even jellies, they use a lot of sugar to make jellies and jams. And that's when you started seeing people get creative. That's where recipes started coming out where applesauce, bananas started becoming substitutes for oils. Things that were hard to come by, they adapted to it and they found substitutes that would still give them the same texture, but it was available and it was less expensive. So ingenuity came about. And we don't have food rationing like they did during the war. But if you look at what's going on in the news and what we've experienced even the last couple years, there's food shortages left and right. I don't know how many times I've gone to the store to buy my favorite, brand or favorite item, and I'm not a brand snob. I don't care if it's name brand or not. I'm looking for the deals. I'm looking for competition, because when there's multiple items out there that they want you to buy their product, you get better deals on it because they'll compete against each other. Well, when that market starts to dissipate and there's only one version of it, I don't have a choice. I have to pay whatever they tell me I have to pay, because I have to have that item unless I get creative and can find something else. So there's food shortages coming. So whether you're the type of person who you're interested in canning because you love gardening and you don't know what to do with all the produce, or maybe you're in the same camp as me, you're in the same boat, you're looking to save money for your family. You've got a growing family, you want to be able to give them, supply as much food as possible without breaking the bank. Canning is a way of doing that. Or maybe it's because you kind of see the writing on the wall and what's coming down the pike. I don't know. Things could get better tomorrow. Things could get worse. I honestly, I don't know. I'm not predicting anything, but maybe that's the reason. And you would fall into what people would call like more of the preppers. You want to be prepared. Well, learning this type of skill, food preservation, is a way of preparing. It's being able to be more self-sustaining, self-reliant. You don't depend on the stores to provide food for your family during the fall and winter months when you can't go out and grow or pick fresh. You have to know how to preserve food in order to sustain. So canning isn't the only way of food preservation. I know that's what we're here to talk about today, but just real quick, some of the ways to preserve food would be dehydrating. This is old school, dehydration. We're not even talking the fancy machines that, have all these little slides, and they cost about $200-300 for, the big pro machines that you can do a whole bunch of it at the same time. You can build a dehydration machine. You need heat, air, and sunlight. And sunlight's even questionable. As long as the air is flowing, that's what dries out the food. And people have built their own solarization contraptions that have a vent on the bottom where the air is sucked in, and then it's convection heat. It'll blow, and that's what dries the food out. You can make a dehydrator using 2 window screens and some clamps. And you put your food in between the window screens to keep the bugs off, put it on some sawhorses out in a nice sunny spot so the air can flow through and the sun beats down, and it'll dry within 24 to 36 hours. You can get away with dehydration. So it is old school food preservation, and they use this a lot in the old days, a lot. The newer version of that would be freeze drying. And out of all the food preservation ways, I think this one would end up being probably the most expensive on the front end. A freeze drying machine can cost anywhere from $1,100 to $2,000 depending on the model you get. However, the pros to it is that when food is freeze dried, it can store for 25 years on a shelf. Your jars aren't going to keep that long. I mean, I wouldn't want to eat it. So you never know. Not knocking your canning ability, but it doesn't have the preservation method that freeze drying foods will. And you can put oxygen absorbers in those little, fancy shiny Mylar bags, and it sucks it all out, and you have food that is shelf stable for 25 years. Biggest downside to that, in my personal opinion looking at it, is one, the cost. That's a lot to invest in something that you're not 100% sure you're really going to like. I would recommend you go and get some freeze-dried foods and test it. How do you like it? A lot can be said in how you preserve food. What does it taste like? The best example I can give is when I was growing up, I hated vegetables. Maybe I should say I hated my mom's vegetables. I'll put it that way. She could never figure out. I detested the green beans that she made. And she made green beans a lot. That was like the number one vegetable in our house was green beans. But they tasted furry and chewy, and I hated them. And I actually sat on a radiator bench in Chicago. The old-fashioned radiators that were built into the wall. They're about chair high. My dad built a bench top so we could sit on it. It was really nice in the winter too. You had the warmest seat in the house, but we would sit on that as our bench, and then the table came right up to us. And when nobody was looking, I remember anytime she made those chewy, furry green beans, I would snatch them and I'd throw them behind the radiator. It was the perfect spot. Nobody looks behind the radiator. And everything was going great until our Cocker Spaniel ratted me out and started digging and scratching at the wall. And my mom's like, what in the world? So she goes over there and starts prying the radiator away and sweeping, and she found my vegetable stash. Ooh, I couldn't sit down for a week after that. And then I was banned to sitting in a kitchen chair. I was never allowed on the radiator again. But she would get so frustrated because we go over to our pastor's house, and his wife made green beans, but hers, I would go back for seconds and thirds. Green beans are green beans. That's what I thought as a kid. But whatever she did to hers, whether it was the bacon she put in there or a little bit of butter or the seasoning, they would melt in my mouth. And I remembered that. And I loved them. And she's like, why? You won't eat mine. What's wrong with mine? And I finally just told him, like, yours are furry and chewy. I don't know why. I like hers. And come to find out, it's because Mom froze her green beans. Mrs. Heyman canned her green beans. When you can things, it changes the flavor and the texture. It's soft. They melt in your mouth. If that's the texture you like, canning is the way to go. Now, when you freeze things, it's going to have a little bit of a different texture to it. It's going to retain more of that chewiness, is what I like to call it. But some things do better freezing. And not everything needs to be canned. Some things you're going to can, and it's going to turn to mush. You do not want to can it. So keep that in mind. Freeze-dried foods, getting back to this point, is freeze-dried foods, all the moisture has been sucked out of it, and then you have to rehydrate it with boiling water. What do you think the texture is going to be? I would say that it's going to be borderline between chewy and mush. It just is. Some things it'll be great for. But if that's your main staple, if you're doing that with all of your food, you better hope that your family likes chewy and mushy food. That's think about that. That's just how it is. So you have to think about how your family will eat it. If it's not worth investing in that just so you can say, oh, I have food for 25 years, that's great. But if you're not going to eat it, what's the point? Preserve food how you know you will like it, you will eat it. That's what you're trying. That's the goal. The other way is vacuum sealing, and this method it can go hand in hand with others. You can vacuum seal your meat, but that's in correlation with freezing. You can't just vacuum seal your meat and leave it on your shelf. It has to be chilled. It has to stay at a certain temperature. So that's when you're going to take vacuum sealing and you would double it with freezing, putting it in the freezer. But you could also, vacuum sealing is used with dry goods. Have you guys seen those food savers where they have the attachment, this cord that attaches and you put it on your canning lids, your jars, and you vacuum seal it? Well, another way that is incorporated, it's called dry canning. So if you don't have the fancy food saver machinery, you actually can take your canning jars, you fill them with your dried goods, noodles, flours, grains, those types of things, put your band and your lid and band on, and you put it inside your oven and you heat it to a certain temperature. And what it does is it's just sucking the oxygen out. It sucks down the lid, creating an airtight seal. And it then will keep on your shelf for an extended period of time. Not the 25 years again, but close. You get at least, I think they say it's an average about 5 years if you dry can or vacuum seal your dry ingredients. Another way of combining is they take dehydration and they turn it into food powders. Is anybody familiar with food powders? 1, 2, okay. Now they say the benefit to this is that it takes up a lot less space. I watched a YouTube post recently where she was showing, she had this huge basket of garden tomatoes, and she's like, I would normally have to do, X amount of hours standing here peeling and cutting it up, but I'm going to show you the shortcut, and it's not going to take any room at all. And she slices them all up, puts them on her trays, leaves them, and then the magic of TV, and she comes back, she's like, now that they're dehydrated, and she throws them in her blender, and she turns it into powder. This whole entire basket of tomatoes, and she turns it into, I think it was like half a pint of powder. A whole basket into half a pint of powder. She's like, now when I go to make this, it's 1 part powder to like 6 parts water, and I get spaghetti sauce, and I just cook it down. What? Okay. And she's like, you could do this with other vegetables. Are your kids struggling to eat their veggies? Well, you can throw it in the food and they won't even know it's there. And all of these other benefits. So that's how, you could use food powders as a way of minimizing space and preserving it. We talked about the dry canning in there. And then, of course, we're going to talk and discuss water bath canning and pressure canning. Those of you, using jars with lids and bands. And then the other old-fashioned way was salting and smoking meats. Now, we still have this today. People still have homemade smokers. You can buy a fancy smoker. When the food is smoked, it doesn't have to be refrigerated. It creates a seal. It encapsulates it. Oxygen is what causes spoilage. Oxygen and sunlight. So when you keep things in a cool, dark area that have been sealed, they last longer. So we don't necessarily salt meat at the butcher anymore, but over in Nairobi, Kenya, when I was there visiting, I remember going to the open market and walking down the road, and you'd see this huge piece of beef, like half a side of cow hanging there, and people just walk up and be like, oh, I want, such and such, and they would go and hack off a chunk of it, and as soon as that piece of meat was cut, the cut piece was wrapped up and handed to the customer, and then they had these huge tubs of coarse salt, and they would just scoop handfuls and rub it and pack it onto the cut piece of meat. You didn't see one fly on that meat. You didn't see any signs of spoilage, nothing. Salt is a preserving agent. And that salt cut off the oxygen, so it meant that they didn't have to keep it refrigerated. I don't know, what the extent is. If the USDA got a hold of that, or the FDA, we'd be in big trouble. So we don't do that here in America. But in third world countries and stuff, they still use those practices because it's effective. Salt is a very effective agent that you could utilize. It pulls out splinters from your fingers if you soak in salt water. It will help draw out infections. And so you can imagine what happens when you add it to foods. And you're packing it in its raw form to a food. It will help with the preservation. And then we have cold storage, which root cellars, or what I grew up knowing them as, is the basement. you would go, you go down into the basement. Everybody in Illinois had basements there. I don't know why. You would think you would have them here more for storm shelters, but basements were a big thing. It was cool down there, and my mom's basement would just be lined with shelves. She'd have her empty jars on one side, and then the whole rest of it. You would think she had enough green beans to feed the entire town down there, and tomatoes and everything under the sun. It would all just be lining these shelves because it's cool and it's dark. And it's just out of the way. I mean, when you start canning, you're going to have jars galore everywhere. So you got to think about the system. But root cellars was how they kept their food and preserved it longer. Well, then there's something called a root clamp. Does anybody know what a root clamp is? Have you ever heard this term? It's basically a big hole dug in the ground. You dig a huge hole in the ground, and hopefully your water level is low, and you would layer straw or hay on the bottom of it, and then put all of your root vegetables. So you could use potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, parsnips, radishes, you've got your onions, cabbage even, carrots, all of those root-type vegetables, and you would layer them. In between every layer of vegetable, you would put more hay or straw and create a barrier in between so they weren't pressed on top of each other. My thought on that was, well, either you're going to be, getting real creative with your cooking because you're like, and this week we were eating all cabbage, everything cabbage, or you would have to come up with a system like so many cabbage, so many potatoes, so many carrots. But that's what it was. It was just layers of food protected by hay and straw buried in the ground using that, was it geothermal? Because it's cool down there and you've kept it from sunlight. And those are the two main factors that cause food spoilage. Then the other one that is becoming a little bit more popular nowadays, people are talking about it more, learning how to do food preservation, is called water glassing. Now, how many of you guys have heard this term? No? Okay, nobody's heard water glassing. This specifically is for eggs. Did you know that refrigeration in the United States did not become mainly used in households until the late 1940s? Mid to late 1940s is when refrigeration became more popular. Majority of households, like here in Arkansas, more rural areas, we did not have refrigerators. We would use things that were like the dugout, the root cellars to keep things cool. But a lot of times you either had your own chickens, so you had fresh eggs daily. And if you didn't, there would be like a market or you'd barter with a neighbor. But you had fresh eggs. They never were sitting on store shelves and you couldn't just go to your grocery store and buy X number of eggs and keep them. Well, if you don't have chickens, it's like, well, how do you keep your eggs from going bad? Some people would pickle them, but once you pickle them, they've been boiled. They're boiled eggs in a brine, so you're not going to be serving those for breakfast, really. It's not the same, and you can't mash them up and put them in your cake batter. That doesn't work either. So water glassing, what it is if you're not familiar with chickens, God created them to do this awesome thing. When they birth that egg, when they push it out, if you're watching, if you've ever seen a chicken birth an egg, it's really amazing. It's wet. When they birth that egg, it's wet and shiny. And as you watch, within seconds, it starts to dry. And as it dries, the color changes. That liquid is called the bloom. The bloom is really like a sealant of the eggshell. That egg, in and of itself, once it is birthed, is completely protected. You can keep it on your counter as long as the temperature stays the same. You store it outside on the counter. If it was birthed outside, you can keep it outside. If it was cold, you need to keep it cold. You don't want the temperature fluctuating because that can affect the egg and breed bacteria. But as of oxygen penetrating the eggshell and it becoming contaminated, it won't happen. No air can get through that bloom. And so those eggs, fresh eggs that are unwashed, will last a long time. And so what they would do is they would take these fresh, clean eggs, because then you don't want poop on them, because if there's poop, you got to clean it. And therefore, if you clean it, you wash the bloom off. So there's like these prerequisites to doing it. But a nice, fresh, clean egg, you put it inside a jar, and you would mix a compound of, it's called hydrated lime, or otherwise known more commonly as pickling lime. Pickling lime is just a powder. It is abrasive to skin, so you don't want to put your hands in as much as possible. Wear gloves, but because it'll dry your skin out really, really fast. But you would put I think it's 1 ounce of pickling or hydrating lime to 1 quart of water, and you mix it separately. You just mix it up. When you've laid all your eggs inside your container, however big you want it or small, you can use a quart jar, you can use a half gallon, however you can get your hand in there. You don't want to drop your eggs. You don't want them to be cracked. And then you just top it off with the water and then just continue filling until the whole container's full. Put a lid on it, put it in someplace nice, cool, and dark, and you've got eggs for up to 2 years. Seriously. The only difference between a fresh egg and a water glassed egg is the water glass egg will be a little bit runnier. So just keep in mind, you're not going to get sunny side up eggs because proteins break down over time. That's just life. It happens. The whites get thinner, they're not going to be stiff, and the yolk will be runny. So they're great for scrambled eggs, great for baking, not so much for fried eggs, unless you don't mind not having a nice solid yolk in there. But those are all just some of the ways that we still today preserve. But today specifically, we want to learn about canning, water bath canning and pressure canning. Who knows where canning came from? Does anybody know the history of this? Kind of a Jeopardy moment. All right, back in 1795, Napoleon Bonaparte offered a 12,000 franc reward for the invention of a new food preservation method. See, during the war, they were losing. And he realized that in order to feed his troops who were starving and were weak and getting sick and all of that, he needed food. You can't grow food in the winter. I mean, they needed a way of food preservation. How can we take our harvest and extend it so we have good, nutritious food for our troops to eat so we can win this war? So it became an important part. Just like during World War II. What did they say? Victory, growing a garden was victory. They encouraged everybody, grow food, preserve food. This is important. Food is important. It will make or break a country. It will win or you will lose a war based on your food. If your troops are hungry, if your people are hungry, they're not going to be productive. They're not going to have strength. They're not going to have stamina. It's going to cause riots because food is a fundamental basic ingredient that everybody needs to survive. So he realized he needed to do something to encourage a food preservation method. Well, it wasn't until 1809, so 14 years later, Nicholas Appert wins Napoleon's reward with a method that heat processed food in glass jars and used sealing wax to seal it. It was kind of like if you think of a mesh wire, and then they would cap it and seal the entire thing with wax. The whole thing was covered in wax to the top. But that's where it started. And it wasn't until 1858 when John L. Mason, hence the mason jars, John L. Mason patents jars with screw-on thread and rubber seal lids. And this is where the game was changed. This is where, to this day, we are still using almost the identical equipment that he invented and patented back in 1858. The method has not changed any. The only thing that has changed is we've gotten better at the science behind it and have it safer now than it was back then.
Well, that was part 1 of my talk, Food Preservation Canning for Beginners. In part 2, we'll talk more specifically about the process of canning itself as I deal with the tools, equipment, and the science of canning. That's where I noticed people really started taking notes as we got into the details of how canning is done. And for all you visual learners out there, if you'd like to see the slides or handout used during the original class, we'll include a link in the description. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that and keep listening through the class. Thank you for listening up to this point. If you haven't subscribed to our channel already, I invite you to do that. If you have any questions about canning, I encourage you, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Until next time, God bless.